I used to work the night shift at a supermarket a couple of years ago. It was mostly routine stuff, stocking shelves, running the register, and dealing with the occasional late-night shopper. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one night. It's something I'll never forget. It was around 11 p.m., just before closing time. The store was practically empty, and I was the only cashier left on duty. I was finishing up some paperwork at my register when I noticed someone walk through the automatic doors. I didn't think much of it at first. Late-night customers weren't unusual, but something about this guy immediately gave me a bad feeling. He looked off. His clothes were filthy, like he hadn't changed them in days. His hair was greasy, sticking to his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles beneath them. He didn't grab a cart or basket. Instead, he just wandered slowly down the aisles, his hands in his pockets, not looking at the shelves but watching me. Every time I glanced up, there he was, standing at the end of whichever aisle I happened to be near, staring at me. His eyes never blinked, and his lips were twisted into this unsettling half-smile. It wasn't friendly. It was like he was waiting for something. My skin crawled. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just weird. But then, as the minutes dragged on, he didn't pick anything up. He was just roaming, circling the store like a predator. At one point, he walked by the checkout area without saying a word, brushing close enough to my counter that I could smell him. He reeked of sweat and something else, something metallic. It felt like hours, but eventually, he stopped at one of the displays. I didn't realize what he had picked up until he walked toward me, holding a large butcher's knife. There was no packaging, just the knife, shining under the store's fluorescent lights. He placed it on the counter and stood there, staring at me with that same twisted grin. I tried to keep my voice steady. "That'll be $19.99, I said. He didn't move, didn't pull out any money. He just leaned in, close enough that I could smell his rancid breath, and whispered, "I don't have any money, but I'll take it. I need it for later." My throat tightened and I could barely breathe. My fingers hovered over the register, not knowing what to do. He wasn't threatening me outright, but the way he said it, so calm and deliberate, it was like he was telling me exactly what was going to happen. I forced a laugh, tried to play it off like a joke. "Sorry, I can't do that. Store policy." He didn't laugh. His smile widened, and he reached out, grabbed the knife by the handle, and walked out of the store without another word. I stood there for a long time, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Once I regained control of myself, I called the store manager, told them what had happened. They didn't believe me at first, thought I was exaggerating, but when we checked the security cameras, the guy didn't show up. Not once. No one fitting his description had even entered the store that night. I quit that job a month later. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me long before he even stepped into the store, and every time I work late, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for whatever he needed that knife for. I worked in the meat department at a supermarket for a few years. It was an okay job, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I mostly worked the closing shift, which meant I had to clean up the back area and the meat locker after hours. The store was quiet at night, almost too quiet sometimes, but one night something happened that still makes me shiver every time I think about it. It was a late shift, close to midnight, and I was finishing up cleaning the cutting station. The lights in the store were dim, except for the ones in the back where I worked. I was the only one there. At least that's what I thought. I just finished mopping up when I heard a noise coming from the meat locker. It was subtle at first, like something soft was dragging across the floor. I figured it was just the fans inside the locker, or maybe one of the boxes had shifted, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. This time, it sounded like chewing. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. There it was again. This wet, smacking sound, like someone eating. My heart started racing. The locker was locked. No one was supposed to be in there. My first thought was that maybe a raccoon or some other animal had gotten in somehow. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. It was someone eating. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the locker, trying to stay calm. I was telling myself it was nothing, maybe just a sound from the machinery, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. When I opened the locker door, the cold air rushed out, chilling me to the bone. For a moment, I just stood there, too stunned to react. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it couldn't. There was a man crouched in the corner near the back of the locker. He was wearing filthy clothes, his hair was matted with dirt, and his face was smeared with blood. He was hunched over a slab of raw meat, gnawing on it like a wild animal. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I just stood there frozen. He didn't notice me at first. He was too focused on the meat, tearing into it with his teeth, blood dripping down his chin and onto the floor. But then he looked up. His eyes were wide, crazed, like he hadn't slept in days. He smiled at me, his teeth stained red, and whispered, "Fresh, so fresh." I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. I slammed the locker door shut and locked locked it, my hand shaking so badly I could hardly get the key in the lock. I ran to the manager's office, told him what I had seen, but when we went back to check the locker, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no blood, no meat out of place, nothing. They said I must have imagined it, that I was tired, but I know what I saw. That man was real. And sometimes when I walk by the meat department late at night, I swear I can still hear the sound of him chewing. Working the late shift in a supermarket can mess with your head sometimes. The store feels different at night, quieter, darker, like something's watching you from the shadows. I worked as a stalker for a few years, mostly night shifts, and there was one night I'll never forget. It still haunts me. It was a typical shift, and I was stocking shelves in aisle 9, the cereal aisle. I'd been at it for a few hours when I noticed something strange. There was a guy standing at the end of the aisle, just standing there. He wasn't looking at the shelves or picking anything up. He was just staring. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people get weird when they shop late at night. Maybe he was just tired. But then, as I moved further down the aisle, I noticed he was following me, slowly, not too close, but always watching. His eyes never left me. I kept my head down, focused on my work, but every time I looked up, he was there. His clothes were dirty, his skin pale, and he had this creepy grin on his face. Not a friendly smile, something more sinister, like he knew something I didn't. I moved to another aisle, trying to shake him, but he followed. Every time I turned a corner, there he was, always a few steps behind me, never saying a word. My heart started racing, and I knew something was wrong. He wasn't shopping. He was stalking me. After what felt like hours of this, I ducked into the stockroom, hoping to hide until he left. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside the door, slow, deliberate. He had followed me back there. I held my breath, praying he would go away, but then the footsteps stopped. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "Open the door," he whispered through the crack. "I just want to talk." I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was no way I was opening that door. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, and everything went silent. I stayed locked in the stockroom for the rest of my shift, too scared to leave. The next morning, I told my manager about the guy, but when they checked the cameras, there was no sign of him. It was like he had never been there at all, but I know what I saw. And now, every time I stock aisle 9, I feel like he's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return.